My name is Tim, and I'm a grateful believer in recovery from codependency, sexual addiction, anger, ACA, and I'm a survivor of sexual abuse. I was born in Elyria, Ohio, the only son of an automotive service manager and a homemaker. My dad loved racing stock cars, and when I was 4 years old, I went to go see my dad race. It was the only race I ever saw, and as it turned out, it was his last. Because during that short race, his throttle stuck, and he crashed into the wall, and the car exploded. My mom screamed hysterically, but I didn't understand at that moment that my dad wasn't coming home. During the 6 years that followed, I found comfort in food. Captain Crunch and I became good friends. And in 4th grade, I weighed 142 pounds with a waist of 36 inches, husky, as we used to say. Being fat was miserable because the other kids' comments were so brutal. I still hear their words, I still bear the scars, and I'm still self-conscious to this day of my weight and appearance. I learned to be an angry kid, and my anger helped me feel like I was more in control. My friend Stevie lived a few streets down from me, and one day when I was 9 years old, I went out into the woods behind my house where Stevie's older brother was waiting for me. His name was Jim, and he sexually abused me that day. And when he told me that he would kill my mother and me if I told anyone, naturally, I believed him. I hid that guilt and shame for over 25 years, and I never realized it wasn't my fault. My mom, on the other hand, found her comfort in alcohol, and within 6 years, she managed to drink herself to death. She died of cirrhosis of the liver in December of 1966. 10 years old, and I was all alone. All I had left was my dog, Molly. My mom's sister took me in, and I had to change schools that year, and I didn't do so well. I remember times going into the bathroom to cry so that no one would see me. I felt so alone. My aunt and uncle managed to clean out my house and either give away or sell everything I had, and I think it hurt the most when they sold my dog, Molly. And that summer, they went on vacation, leaving me with another family member. I thought eventually they would return and I would go and I would stay with them because I really idolized them. But when they came back, they never answered their door. They never picked up their phone, and it was their way of saying, "We don't want you anymore." That summer, I bounced from one uncle's house to another, trying to find a place to stay, and during my brief stay with one uncle, my own cousin threatened me with a knife, and he sexually abused me. So at this point, I would no longer allow myself to trust anyone because everyone that I'd ever cared about either left me, didn't want me, or abused me. All I knew is that I was completely alone and that to survive, I'd have to take care of myself. And at this time, I was only 11 years old. In August of 1967, I landed at my Uncle Walt and Aunt Agnes's home, and they already had 4 kids. It seemed that my uncle wanted me there more than my aunt did. And I stayed there, and eventually they adopted me just before my 12th birthday. Now, life is not easy for an angry fat kid who's used to being an only child. I didn't know what it was like to interact with siblings, much less older ones. Share? What's that? I was selfish, untrusting, and had a pretty foul mouth. My new mom applied a different standard to me than to her own kids, which was easy for me to see, and it made me resentful. So I was always in trouble, it seems. Not serious trouble, but trouble nevertheless. I had a new home, a new family, but I still lived in fear and loneliness. I was sure it wouldn't last. Nothing else ever had. And as I grew older, I looked forward to the day when I could leave. That day eventually came 2 weeks before my 19th birthday, when I moved out. It was ugly, and I hurt my adopted parents. I blamed them and other family members for my mom's death, using that as my excuse to move out and be free. But my newfound freedom eventually turned into bondage. My behavior turned dark, and my life was characterized by drinking, drugs, and whatever sexual encounters I could find. I married a girl I knew while I was in high school, but it lasted less than 2 years. I was unfaithful, and I found ways to justify it. We moved to Columbus and attended Ohio State University. And while there, I met another girl and was unfaithful once again. My wife never knew of either affair, and so when I told her I wanted a divorce, it came as a shock to her. I was still only 22 years old. For the next 6 months, I went from one relationship to another, taking and discarding women just to try to fill my own loneliness. But no one ever really knew who I was on the inside because I never let anyone get that close. I just created my own mental and emotional fortress. I moved to California in 1978, and the scenery and the names changed, but my life didn't. I continued to drink, to use drugs, and to use sex. I left a lot of wreckage trying to fill my own loneliness, but the drugs, alcohol, and sex never helped. They only left me wanting more. I only knew my second wife for a month before we got married. I don't know, does this sound compulsive to you? 3 months later, though, I came to know Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. I wish I could say at this point that my inability to trust finally disappeared, but it didn't. It spilled right over into my new marriage and into my newfound relationship with God. I just didn't want to lose control of my life. But I did manage to find confidence in theology. I amassed quite a lot of Bible knowledge and felt as though I had the answers for everything and everyone, except myself, of course. Without knowing it, I had become a Pharisee. I became harsh, opinionated, and felt that everyone else was wrong except those in my own little group. My own little group was me, though. I didn't feel arrogant, I just thought I was right. During the next 21 years, I had 3 kids. I went back to school, got 2 more degrees, ran a prison ministry, became an ordained pastor, planted a church, and established a sports ministry. The drugs had long since disappeared, and I simply chose not to drink in order to not put a stumbling block in front of anyone else. But I was still motivated by fear and by distrust and was constantly driven to achieve in order to be recognized, so maybe I could find a way to accept myself. The education and accomplishments couldn't do it, though, and my life seemed like a hopeless contradiction. And as a pastor, who was I going to talk to? 15 years into our marriage, my second wife confessed to having had an affair. Ironically, she confessed right after I had finished teaching about forgiveness. So she sought it from me, and I felt obligated to give it. Great, I thought, I have to use this too. I was crushed, and I felt totally violated. But I thought that if I would grant forgiveness to her, it would take away the pain. But it didn't, because I never processed the pain. I just stuffed it. And although I was physically faithful to her, I had many mental affairs. When the marriage went south, I got into Christian therapy, and I was willing to accept all responsibility for my bad marriage in order to save it, and felt that everything was completely my fault. No codependent traits here. But God brought a lot of healing during this time and prepared me for his next step. When a friend suggested Celebrate Recovery to me, I thought, you obviously have me mistaken as being one of those. Then one day I was in Diedrich's Coffee reading my Bible, convicted about my anger. In walks Joe. It was Joe from yesterday. Celebrate Recovery hat like a lighthouse on his head. We talked, and he invited me to Celebrate Recovery, so I agreed to attend that Friday night. And when Joe was the very first person I spotted at Celebrate Recovery, I knew God had me there for a reason. After the worship service, I intended to go to the men's anger group, but a guy who I hadn't seen in nearly a year, his name is Daryl, he grabbed me and he dragged me into the codependency group where I've been ever since. He said, you don't want to go in the anger group. They're really mad in there. So there I was in the men's codependency group, and I see a guy sitting across from me, and he looks familiar, but I can't place him. So the introductions take place. He says, hi, I'm Jerry. I'm a believer who struggles with. And then I remember 9 years earlier, when I had bought my house, I had my yard landscaped by a gifted but a cocky guy named Jerry. I couldn't believe it. It was him. And he invited me to his new 12-step study group. I purchased the Celebrate Recovery workbooks and the Life Recovery Bible, and I joined that Monday night step group. And God used that step group to save my life and my sanity. For the first time in my life, I was able to tell everything about myself, who I was, what I had done, what I had felt, what had been done to me. And my group listened to me. They didn't judge me. They didn't give me advice. They didn't try to fix me. They didn't try to control me. They simply loved and accepted me. For the first time in 40 years, I felt unconditionally loved. My sponsor recommended that I get involved in service, so I believed him, and I got involved. And I joined the pizza team and the barbecue team, and later I helped out with Solid Rock. But I want to share a very important breakthrough with you this morning with regard to my 9th step. As you know, the 9th step states, we made direct amends to such people whenever possible, except to do so would injure them or others. As I mentioned, I was sexually abused as a child, and in my heart, I had always hated the individuals who had done this to me. Yet during the 8th step, God instructed me to put them on the list. I was reluctant, but I did it anyway, because I knew I had to clean the whole house. I wrote both those guys letters I knew that I could never send to them. I had no way of knowing where Jim was, and with regard to my cousin, it was one of those issues that could seriously hurt the family. As I wrote the letter to Jim, picture this, I'm sitting in a Starbucks. I began to detail how I felt about him. All the years of wreckage and pain that had resulted from what he had done to me. I explained in the letter that I was extending forgiveness to him as a part of my 9th step, and even if he didn't feel like he did anything wrong, that wasn't the issue. It wasn't about him. It was about me and God. At that instant, God changed my heart, and I realized I didn't want Jim to suffer God's wrath for what he had done to me, the very thing I had hoped for my entire life. I began to weep, and my anger melted away, and I only felt compassion. I began to pray for him and ask God to forgive him of his sins against me and to not count them against him. How amazing. In that instant, God changed my heart towards someone I had hated for over 35 years. Now I found myself weeping in a coffee shop over his salvation. When God works, he really works. During my first year of recovery, I experienced more pain and shed more tears than I ever have before. I've revisited and reopened wounds that I had only hoped to hide and to bury. And as I began to accept what I had done, what had been done to me, and to openly grieve through it, I found healing. My guys helped me metabolize the hurt, and the phone list became my lifeline. And although my initial step study group has long since been completed, we still hold one another accountable on a regular basis. My life has undergone a transformation, and God has given me miraculous hope. When the marriage ended, I thought that I could never again open up my heart to a woman. Thankfully, I was wrong, and God had other plans. One night at a men's retreat, my friend Jerry, this is the same Jerry, informed me that he had set me up for a date. What do you mean you set me up? Who is she? As it turned out, she happened to be the most beautiful, amazing, precious, and wonderful woman in the world. Did I mention she was beautiful? Our friendship grew into a dating relationship. We fell in love, and in March of this year, Lori became my wife. Through Lori, God has taught me more about his grace and love than I've ever known, and he continues to teach me. Now I'm in acceptance that I am a person of value, that I matter to God and to others. God loves me, and others love me, even though I'm still a big chocolate mess. I know my value comes not from my achievements, or my education, but from the simple fact that I'm created in the image of God and I am the object of his love. Today, by his grace, I have the privilege of co-leading the men's Friday night men's codependency group, but also a men's codependent 12-step group. It's so awesome to be able to give back. I've learned that recovery is a journey rather than a destination to be arrived at, that struggle is normal, and that to be reasonably happy in this life is as good as it gets. I no longer regret my past because God has used it to bring me to where I am today and continues to use it to display his love and power to others. And as hard as it was all worth it. Finally, I've learned that I really can trust. My friends in recovery get it. They're the most real, accepting, and precious people I've ever known. They have struggles, but they're not in denial about it. They're just like me. And I was wrong. I am one of those. My life verse is 2 Corinthians 5:15, which says, "And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died and rose again on their behalf." Thank you for letting me share.